Like many people this week, I've been watching the news coming out of Melbourne in relation to the hotel quarantine security, seeing reports of dodgy subcontracting, shift ghosting, staff sleeping on shift, and even staff having inappropriate relationships with hotel guests. Currently and independently of this, the Victorian regulators are conducting a review of the security industry. And so at this time, the spotlight is well and truly on the industry. And it's time now that we use that spotlight to recognise that these issues are not isolated to the Victorian security industry. They're not isolated to this particular security project. They're endemic across the industry nationwide. We need to look at who's responsible for the issues that we're seeing. And it's not enough just to blame the particular guard or the particular small firm involved in the process. We need to look at clients who are putting contracts out to the lowest common denominator for the lowest price with inappropriate resourcing. They're not looking at the capabilities of which firms are actually able to deliver specific projects. They're not looking at what rate a company would need to be compliant. They're not looking at what resourcing that company would need to safely and properly undertake a job. There's no risk management process involved. It's just purely down to the bottom dollar. And unfortunately, when this happens, quite often we see one of a handful of the largest companies in the country, we all know who they are, who it seems are culturally essentially too big to fail. These big firms take contracts at tiny margins, and they do this because on many, many occasions they know they're just going to subcontract that work out. So if you're only making a few percent, that's fine if you're not doing any work towards it and you have no overheads in relation to it. They then subcontract the work down to a smaller firm, minus the only profit margin that existed in the contract. So that smaller firm now needs to take the work, but they need to find a way to cut costs and make a margin. They have to do that by cutting training, resourcing, supervision, or staff wages, staff entitlements, staff insurances, all those other things that are legally mandated, but very rarely legally enforced. That subcontractor quite often subcontracts further and further, and every time that happens, the result just gets worse. Quite often, whenever we see failings in the industry like this, we see the employee in trouble, or we see their employer in trouble. Rarely do we see these big firms being held accountable for their practices, knowing full well that when they hand a contract down at a rate of $25 or $26 an hour like we see all the time, there is no way that that subcontractor has the ability to be compliant at that rate. The subcontractor is always the one held accountable. The big firms wash their hands of it every time, and the client, even when it's a government client at local, state or federal level, is never held responsible for the fact that they put together a security program that was inefficient, inappropriate, sometimes dangerous, based on very little tangible information, and essentially led to illegal practices within the security industry. We need to look at how easy it is to enter the security industry, both for firms and for individuals. For a firm to enter the industry is simply a matter of paperwork, much of which can just be bought online for almost no money. And when we look at individuals entering the security industry, we need to recognise that the vast majority of these people are coming from job placement agencies where their training and certification is all funded and where they're subsidised by the government to be at that training. The market is actively recruiting the lowest common denominator, and in some states quite often that's international students, people without much cultural or industry understanding, sometimes with very little English skills, sometimes with very little professional background. And it's actively deterring people who would have an immediate positive impact on the industry, like ex-military, ex-police, people with international security experience. Because if you have an education from prior background, you're not eligible for government funding. So for you to achieve up to Certificate 4 and a few specialist electives like your bodyguard or your private investigation license, you could be looking at $10,000 and 3 or 4 months of self-funded time off work to undertake that training, all to enter an industry that is just so full of problems and holes at the moment that it's a pretty unattractive prospect. So, Empire Protection is a veteran-owned business, and we actively try and seek transitional pathways for ex-law enforcement or defence people to enter the corporate market. But these are just barriers that we're constantly facing, no matter who we work with. We see anecdotal evidence all the time that RTOs are providing certificate training in a tick and flick manner. I myself have undertaken certificate training in multiple states and territories in Australia with multiple RTOs, and on all but one occasion, the answers have just been handed out for every exam, for every test, for every accessible content. The answers are just handed out to the students to ensure they get through to the industry. So the first thing an entrant learns about the industry is that integrity is not required, and everything's just a tick and flick. Now, people don't know what they don't know. So now that person's entered the industry and is being offered unacceptable rates and unacceptable work conditions, but isn't in a position to do anything about that. Regulation is obviously essential, and it's a market that does need to be regulated, but it needs to be regulated in the right way. And we need to recognise that companies that are compliant are going to remain compliant. And the more regulation you put on, the more costs, the more overheads, the more logistics, the more admin time that company has to put in. Therefore, their costs go up. A company who's non-compliant with the existing regulation is probably going to be non-compliant with new regulation, meaning that the gap between their prices and the compliant company prices grows every day. We need to recognise as an industry that there are many levels to the industry, and they are a mile apart. A baseline security manpower provider is not in the same position as a dedicated close protection firm, risk management firm, security consultancy firm, investigative firm, but yet the industry is all just treated as one lowest common denominator, which is the basic manpower security provider, and the failings at that level are put onto the companies at every level. We see simple things like, the security industry is regulated state by state, but security staff aren't really allowed to operate interstate regardless of circumstances. Driver's licenses are managed state by state, but we obviously can drive into another state as required. Now, some states have temporary interstate permits, but it's completely unrecognised that somebody on a close protection task or a private investigation may well be required by their client with little notice to travel between the states. And this is currently forcing quite often smaller niche firms to obtain licensing in every state and territory in the country at exorbitant costs, just on the off chance they might have to travel to somewhere with a particular client. This regulation is prohibitive to the companies that are raising the standard of the industry and doesn't impact those who aren't. There's people living in border towns that have to obtain 2 licenses just for the opportunity to get the same amount of work that they would if they lived in a big city. And that's regulation that's being ignored, while we focus on regulation that achieves nothing because it's just circumvented. And the regulators spend very little time with their finger on the pulse of the industry. Rather, they listen to unions and associations. But you only have to go on Gumtree to see job adverts blatantly for cash, or for $22 an hour flat rate, or where the staff member must have an ABN. All of these are issues that we need to look at, and we need to understand that everybody in this process is accountable. And while the market is allowed to be regulated and operated by those in the industry who sometimes have ties to the government, who sometimes have ties to associations, who have a culture of boys club practices, even anecdotal examples where we see business managers charging personal fees to subcontractors to be awarded contracts. While this is allowed to exist, the industry is not going to improve, and we're going to continue to see the types of things we're seeing at the hotel quarantine venues now. It's time that the regulators get involved. It's time that people in the industry speak up where they can. I understand some people aren't able to due to fear of losing their income. I'm happy to speak, and I'm happy to speak to anybody about the state of the security industry, and I'm happy to support anybody where I can.